Hi everyone, welcome to yet another review, but this one is interesting because it is not of an IM. Guess what this is? So if you haven't been able to guess correctly, you might not have lived, or you might be so deeply buried in the IM rabbit hole that you've not recognized a very classic Focal headphone case. Of course, this is a bit different from the other cases. It does look a lot like the Focal Clear OG case and the Focal Utopia OG case, but this is not either of those headphones. This is none other than the Focal Utopia 2022 version, also called the Utopia, because it is a mouthful to keep saying Focal Utopia 2022 version. So this is my review. This is going to be my review of the Focal Utopia 2022 version. As you can tell, it looks very premium and very artistic. And as a matter of fact, it does look a bit more premium than the other Focal Utopia that I used to own, which is the OG. But in many ways, I do think that the Focal Utopia OG was a better headphone. Like, these differences are very, very minimal. But of course, to the discerning listener, they will not be completely, inaudible. So without further ado, I want to jump right in. I want to structure this review in terms of, I want to first talk about the specs, accessories, and the comfort of this headphone. I want to talk about the tonality or the frequency response of this headphone. And that's going to be interesting because, I'm going to show a graph, of course, because a lot of you like graphs and I don't want to deprive you of what you like. So this is the graph. A lot of you audiophiles out there, I'm an audiophile myself. It is a problematic category in many ways to sort of call yourself an audiophile. I feel like others should be calling you an audiophile. But then, having said all that, I do think a lot of newbie audiophiles like to sort of conflate this hobby with this graph. And oftentimes they think that this hobby has a lot to do with this graph, and it does. But then a lot of people get so beholden to this graph, especially early on in their hobby, that I feel like a lot of reviewers and influencers who want to cater to the widest portion of the market will lead with the graph. I don't want to lead with this graph, but of course I will take you guys through this, wonderful looking graph. I do think it doesn't completely sound like the way it graphs. So I'll talk about all that. I'll talk about how it sounds in terms of tonal performance, and I'll talk about the technicalities, by which, of course, I talk about resolution. I'll talk about soundstage, imaging, and all those funky words and funky concepts. I'll talk about timbre, which is something this headphone is not exactly known for. And then I'll, just give you brief impressions, track by track, so to speak, of how this has sounded to me. I will talk about sources. I have a lot of sources I've tried with this, a lot, because OG Utopia was, very infamous for being very, very source picky. And this is somewhat source picky as well. So in this review, I'll take you guys through my perception of how this sounds with the GSX Mini, of the Prima Luna tube amp. This is a preamp, but of course I want to talk about how this, preamp pairs with this Ferrum Ur amp, because the Ferrum Ur does have fantastic synergy with the Focal Utopia. So more on that later. I'll talk about a whole bunch of stuff. The Rossini, I'll talk about the Focal Arch, which is more difficult to find nowadays. And of course, the Sony DMP Z1, which is a magnum opus from Sony that does pair exceedingly well with the Utopia. So I'll talk about their pairing, the synergy, and all that. So I'll talk about amps and DACs across a wide range of prices, including the more affordable stuff, right? So that's forthcoming. And finally, I'll do some comparisons with other headphones in a similar price point, because this is $5,000. So this is Summit Fi in terms of prices. This is as expensive as it gets. A lot of you, if you have been in this hobby for a bit of time, and if you've owned a Susvara, you might know a Susvara can be had for far cheaper than its retail price of $6,000. An Abyss, however, is more difficult to get for less than $6,000, but it can be had if you know the right dealer. And of course, an Atrium is around $3,500, but the Utopia is very expensive. And I'll talk you guys through my perceptions on how the Utopia compares with other headphones, namely the Susvara, the Abyss TC, the wonderful Atrium, and of course the even more wonderful perhaps Caldera. So without further ado, to jump right in terms of specs and all that good stuff, which I don't like talking about, which in the early part of my review career, so to speak, it's not exactly a career. I just want you guys to know I do this for fun. I do not make money from this, but I try to not lose money from this. So you definitely will see me sell stuff. I sell stuff because I want to buy new stuff, right? Otherwise this channel wouldn't work. I don't get like a plethora and an infinite supply of stuff. I have to buy stuff, right? And of course, I do get stuff from reviewers, from manufacturers rather. So that's that. But it's not my day job. But of course, I love this. I would do this for free if someone hooked me up with an eternal supply of gear. But insofar as my early reviewer career goes, I wasn't very comfortable talking about specs because I was like, whatever. But I do understand many people like talking about specs, like listening to a discussion on specs, either because they want to own this stuff or because they just simply like thinking about specs. So that's that. If you are a spec nerd, you might be relieved to know that this is not very difficult to drive. It is 80 ohms in impedance. Now, 80 ohms in impedance is not very little. It's not as it's not as easily driven as, let's say, an IEM would be. And 80 ohms is like a nice sweet spot between like a 30 ohm planar or a 40 ohm planar and like a 300 or 100 ohm dynamic driver, because that just basically means that this does respond to a wide variety of sources, and different sources will of course have a different kind of compatibility with this impedance curve. It's not a flat impedance curve the Utopia has. It does have a higher impedance in the base frequencies, so that's worth keeping in mind. Its sensitivity is 104 dB, so it's still far easier to drive than a lot of other headphones like the Hifemanso Svara, which has a far lower sensitivity. I don't have the number off the top of my head. You can drive this off a dongle. You should not drive this off a phone. And of course, it's made with the Focal loudspeaker drivers, as a matter of fact. It's a 40 mm pure beryllium M-shaped dome driver. That's a mouthful, but that's what it is. It's heavy. It's not super light. It's not as heavy as the BIS, which I think is around 640 grams. This comes in at a nice 490 grams, almost 500 grams. So it's not light by any means. So this does have this sort of a new pattern, which is sort of based after the new Focal clears, the MGs. This has a hexagonal shape to it. The red accent is not as pronounced as it used to be, and you have a very pronounced Focal logo here. That's a cutout. So the cup is made of plastic, but it's high quality plastic. The grills are made of metal. This is carbon fiber and has a bit of a camo sort of a look going on. This has leather ear pads, which are always very comfortable with micro perforations. You can see the driver inside. And this is, fairly adjustable, has a bit of a give in terms of, having just a wee bit of cup swivel, which tends to happen from this part. And this can create hot spots if you don't have hair, like I don't have hair. But overall, it's fairly comfortable. It's not very clampy. It does have a bit of a clamp, as might be evident. But it's not super clampy, but it's fairly comfortable. But I do find it slightly on the heavier side, so take that for what it's worth. Overall, it is stunning looking. I'm not sure if I prefer the looks over the OG Utopia. I do think it looks more premium, and perhaps that's why they priced it at $5,000. I do want to mention that the Focal Utopia OG can now be had for something between $2,000 to $2,500 on the used market. So at that price, that headphone is the best ever. It is a bargain and then some, and I would encourage you to stop this review if you want any Utopia and buy the used Utopia OG. Forget this guy. Get the used for $2,000 and be done with it. However, if you want to buy the latest and greatest thing, feel free to continue watching the rest of the review. I'm not exactly sure if this is greater or better than the OG Utopia. I do think there are some tuning changes which will appeal to a wider group of people, but that's what it is. Okay, so to now jump right into the discussion on the tonality and the frequency response. Guys, before I show you the graph, I just want to talk about what it sounds like. So overall, Utopia is tuned well. It sounds neutral. It is not the most neutral sounding headphone, but I don't think there is such a thing, because the whole concept of neutral is somewhat subjective to the genre you're listening to. This sort of tuning does work with most genres, but I do think it doesn't work as well with metal, because this neutral-ish tuning basically means it has somewhat of a flat mid-range, a flat bass response, and has some pinna gain. The pinna gain here is evident. The upper mids are very present. It's slightly, ever so slightly pulled back from the Utopia OG, but as is the treble, so it does lack that bit of excitement in the upper mids and the treble compared to the OG Utopia. But I still find it to be more excitable in that sort of range between upper mids and treble than I would find my perfect studio neutral headphone. So by that I mean it is something that I would term as a bit neutral bright. But to compensate for that sort of energy in the upper mid and treble frequency, this is a fairly punchy headphone, which is not something that is explained by the frequency response whatsoever. Okay, again, before I show you the graph, so the bass is fairly extended, but it does lack the last bit of sub-bass energy. Now, just to take you guys through the graph, because that's something I think a lot of people care about, so I'll just show you on my trusty tablet PC, and in case you think I should blow it up a bit, so this is what the graph looks like. Starting with the bass, so the bass is somewhat rolled off after the 30 hertz range, so you do hear that, but interestingly, you don't hear that with every source. Of the i5 Pro Can pro ICANN signature, this sub-bass roll-off was more evident to my ears. However, of the ferrum ore, which is a warmer source in some ways the ICANN can also be warm if you switch on the tube. So that's a different story. And I don't want to debate on what's warm because different things can sound warm. But overall, I would say that the ferrum ore is a warm source, is a smoother source, and does pair well with Utopia. And I'll talk more about amp pairings towards the end of the video. But for now, what you might want to know is that there's a bit of a sub-bass roll-off, and it can be evident, and some people EQ this. I did not like the effect of the EQ because I did feel still that EQ was not exactly like the real thing. It wasn't necessarily as deep and guttural in the sub-bass as it would have been had it been tuned to sound like that from the start with. The EQ to me is a bit of a consolation prize because it doesn't really sound like it fills out the sub-bass. It sort of does, sort of doesn't, if you know what I mean. So it's a pretty smooth. I mean, you see the mid-bass has a slight, ever so slight bump. And it's punchy. The punchiness is not completely explained by this graph because if you think that the mid-bass energy is all that it takes to explain dynamics and punch and slam, then I would disagree because you would need a lot more of a hump here to make it slam as much as it does. It slams a lot, but that's something I like talking about in the technicality section. Moving on. Talking about upper mid, so that you see some energy here between 1 and 2 kilohertz. This also existed in the original Utopia. This portion is problematic. It does make for somewhat nasally vocals. Even the Focal Clear to some degree had nasally vocals, and it doesn't really work out for the rest of the timbre because I do think it introduces some metallicness and some honk. Now, upper mids are very sharp, and it's not sharp to the point that will make your ears bleed. You do want to pair it with the right sources, which doesn't make this too sharp. Because some sources have a way of presenting vocals in a way that's very in your face. So on those sources, this Utopia 2022 can sound a bit fatiguing. Now, going by the graph, the green one is, the teal one rather, is of the original Utopia. Like, it does sound like the original Utopia had more treble. But what I do want to say that the original Utopia's treble peaks were somewhat balanced out by each other and by the upper mid, so much so that I don't necessarily think that this is definitively smoother or anything. It does sound ever so slightly less trebly, but I do think it sounds ever so slightly less dynamic. So that's what's one thing is very evident to me about something that I liked more about the OG Utopia and less about the Utopia 2022. So the OG Utopia, I do think, had, to my mind, a little more exciting and dynamic energy than this Utopia, which I do feel is somewhat reined in. Okay. That's it for technical performance. So the bass is decent. It's a warmish bass. It's a punchy bass, but sub bass is a bit rolled off. Upper mids are protruding with a bit of a honk around 1K. And treble is present, ever so slightly less present in the OG Utopia, but I do think it lacks a bit of excitement compared to the OG Utopia, which makes it a little less exciting overall as a headphone, but perhaps ever so slightly warmer in the treble as a result of this new tuning. I played a bunch of tracks on this. I played Daniel Caesar's Careless, and that was amazing because it sort of, laid bare the great soundstage depth that these Utopias are famous for. Focal does soundstage depth like very few headphones can. It's just layering and layering for days. Image placements are very lifelike, and images have a way of sounding very tall and large on the Utopia. I do feel image size is bigger on the Utopia than on the Susvara even. And I just strictly talk about vertical image size here, which is not something that I think a lot of people quite understand when they start the hobby. And I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but that's just been my experience, given questions I've received. And also, I didn't understand vertical image height myself when I began the hobby, but I do appreciate it more nowadays. And I do think it is one attribute that makes IEMs even sound more speaker-like. Of course, that's a wild comparison, so take that with a pinch of salt. But vertical imaging is super solid, as is pretty evident on the song Careless by Daniel Caesar. I played Danny Elfman's Batman theme, which was awe-inspiring. The dynamic energy on this is still great. It was amazing. The separation was not faked. The one thing about Utopia is that its soundstage is not very wide, but images are still so well separated. It just makes you wonder how it does it. It just makes you think that that's perhaps the gold standard for imaging and soundstage, even though that's not wide, and perhaps every other headphone that has a wide soundstage is faking it. So this soundstage sounds natural is basically what I'm getting at, which was pretty evident from Danny Elfman's Batman theme. Separation again was fantastic. The violin sounds so extended into the deep reaches of the treble. but it was not fatiguing. When the music reaches a crescendo on this track, it was actually scary. And then it stops. Wild ride, and the fact that it stops and starts and gets loud and quiet on the same track without turning the volume up or down, that's what is laying bare its amazing innate ability to do macro dynamics. Okay, moving on. I'll play the song Cherry by Daphne, and it sounded very coherent and lifelike in bass and treble. Electronic music in many ways the Utopia's forte, not so much rock and metal. But I did try the Symphony of Destruction track of Megadeth, a track that I grew up listening to, a track that I know very well. Metal can be used to test headphones, guys. I beg to differ from those of you who just want to play jazz and classical to test headphones, because metal lays bare an ability of a headphone to stage, to sort of layer, to sort of, sound coherent, to sort of resolve finer nuances and sound timbrally accurate. The bass texture on Symphony of Destruction and the distance from which Mustaine's voice arrives at you during the chorus is just, so pleasurable. Marty Friedman's guitars are so crunchy. Overall, I just love how it stages on this track and the crunchiness of electric guitars, although this wouldn't be my top choice for heavy metal. Guys, I keep talking about how it would not be my top choice for heavy metal, and I'll talk about sources here just to give you a sense of how I think different sources perform, because I think if you have the source right, you could play a wide range of tracks and genres on this Utopia. But of course, I mean, not everything works out as well as, other sources do. So the GSX Mini is a wonderful amp if you don't get the volume pot, the upgraded volume pot, which I advise against because it only has 24 steps. So you cannot adjust volume in fine increments, which is something that I got and I learned the hard way. If you get the GSX Mini, it's a good amp. It's warm, but it has a bit of treble air. Does pair well with Utopia. Utopia gets a bit of this grit, this bite, this sort of grunginess to its sound, which can make for an off-putting timbre, but it does work with genres like alternative. If you want to talk about other amps, like I did pair it with the Ferrum Ur. The Ferrum Ur and Hypsis, which is the power supply, is something that I've owned, and it is a lovely, lovely setup, and it does make Utopia sound fantastic. It is one amp that I would highly, highly recommend with the Utopia because of its synergy. It just sounds smoother in the treble. It sounds just warmer, and the best part is you don't feel the bass, sub-bass roll-off, and it sounds punchy and deep and guttural in the sub-bass, and it's just amazing with Utopia. If you add this Prima Luna tube amp, which is the Evo 400, if I'm not mistaken, yes, it is. It is a tube amp that I owned, and I used it as a preamp to the Ferrum Ur. You just get a better sense of holographic, soundstage, better depth, better layering, and it does work beautifully. And these L34 tubes improve the Utopia timbre significantly, so that's worth keeping in mind. If you want to go all out, you might want to get this tube preamp and then get this amp, and you're all set with Utopia. You don't have to get these other headphones then. DCS stuff really worked well with the Utopia. I've tried the DCS Lena stack with the Utopia, which is incredibly expensive, but it was amazing. I've tried the DCS Bartok. The Bartok and the Utopia are a match made in heaven, but the Bartok is silly expensive and perhaps more expensive than it should be. And this is, of course, a more expensive DCS, the DCS Rossini, which has crazy imaging and it makes the Utopia sound absolutely insane. The Focal Arch is an amp, a DAC amp with AK chips that Focal used to make, and you could buy this, and you can still perhaps look for this, and you can get this at a discount. It gets fairly warm, and there are other sort of manufacturing defects that some people have pointed out with the Focal Arch, but I don't think it's an all-encompassing issue. It mostly was a unit issue because I have played with the Focal Arch for long sessions, and I've loved it with the Utopia because it does synergize really well with Focal headphones, and it does have EQ presets you can use with different Focal headphones. FiO stuff are interesting because they sound good, they're cheap, but they have a weird way of doing treble which sound metallic. Something strange happened with Utopia and the FiO M17 because the FiO M17, by the way, is a DAB that one of my friends got and then it died on him, so that's worth keeping in mind. As a matter of fact, it did not die on him, the battery blew out. And then FiO replaced the battery, but that's what it is, he still uses it. Now, with the Utopia, what happens is, although this is somewhat of a metallic sounding DAB in terms of its treble, and you think that this would exacerbate the Utopia treble, that does not happen. Somehow, these two negatives cancel each other out, and I know it's not as simple with audio, it's not straight matte, but that's what happens, guys. That's what happens, and it sounds pretty good. It sounds very lifelike, and the FiO M17 has very lifelike imaging. This setup is not advisable with the Utopia because the Pro IDSD DAC was not... It's a good DAC, but it doesn't really work with the Utopia. It's a bit smooth, but it still doesn't work with Utopia. The ICANN signature is a wonderful amp, works amazingly well with Susvara and Abyss, but it makes Utopia sound a bit sub-bass light and a bit edgy in the treble, so that's worth keeping in mind. Both these amps work really well with Utopia. They're both DAC amps, by the way. The CMA12 Master from Q-Style is a good device. You can have it for $1,200 nowadays on the used market. As a matter of fact, you can have it for $800 on the used market, so that's pretty much of a steal. This guy works well with Utopia. It sounds pretty punchy and dynamic. The Matrix DAC amp, this is wonderful. The Matrix X Saber DAC amp, and although this has a Saber chip inside, it's not very edgy. It does sound slightly thin, but it has wonderful tuning filters which actually work. With this, the Utopia sounds somewhat light and ethereal, which is a nice change from its hard treble. Okay, so what does that leave us with? I've talked about a few M17. The Sony W1ZM2 DAP is just extraordinary, and it works really well with the Utopia. I love it, and it has enough power to drive the Utopia. It just warms up and thickens the sound a bit, and adds a bit more air frequencies to the Utopia. This, of course, the large group precision DAP, which is wonderful and quite expensive and works well with Utopia, but gives you a very narrow sound stage. I want to talk about the WA33 amplifier, which is a gargantuan tube amp, a top-of-the-line tube amp, and it works really well with Utopia, makes it sound very holographic. The WA33 is advised, is something I recommend with Utopia, but of course it's very expensive, so it's not for everybody. But I would venture and say that this amp sounds better with the Utopia, and the synergizes better with the Utopia than it does with the Abyss AB1266, which is what everyone talks about. Okay, Hugo 2, very bright leaning sound, but somehow, again, maybe the negatives cancel each other out again. It does work with the Utopia somehow. Synergy is not something you can always predict by looking at specs on paper or by just looking at sound signatures on paper, but does work. The Earman Angel amp, I've tried the DAC amp with the Utopia. This has somewhat of a warm sound, and it does pair well, and Utopia sounds very sweet on it. And last but not the very least, the Sony DMP Z1, which is, of course, an endgame amp, a DAC amp for IMs and also for dynamic driver headphones that are on the easier, to drive side. It won't drive a Susvara. Is just a match made in sonic heaven. Huge images, slammy for days, great bass extensions, sweet mid-range, and soft treble. Not soft to the point of being limp. I mean, bad choice of words, but not soft to the point of being off-putting, but softer, because the Utopia has harder edges to notes, and that does come through the treble, and makes the treble sound ever so metallic. So that's it for sources, guys. And you can drive it with any number of dongles, which I have not, because this headphone is expensive at around $5,000, and I would not do it the travesty of driving it with a dongle. Insofar as headphone comparisons go, I mean, the Susvara obviously beats it for resolution and timbre and all the good stuff, but it does punch way more than the Utopia. So for punchy genres like EDM and stuff, Susvara is not my jam. The Abyss AB1266 sounds amazing with this bass and wide mid-range, but this beats the Abyss for stage depth, for size of images, and also for mid-range. The Atrium is a wonderful headphone and perhaps even better tuned, but the Utopia out-resolves it. The Caldera, I think, is very close to the Utopia in performance, and what you end up choosing is really your call, because they're both wonderful headphones. So that's it, guys. I mean, why do I think this headphone might not be the best Utopia? Well, I never said that, but I do think that the Utopia OG holds its own. Guys, in making this smoother, I'm not sure if they've improved it, because in making this smoother, it's still metallic sounding. I don't think the timbre has gone away. It's not very metallic, so take that for what it's worth. A lot of instruments are metallic, so it does, replay drums and a lot of other instruments that have metal in them and very accurately. But basically, guys, insofar as the tuning changes go, they're minute, but I do sense that the original Utopia was ever so slightly more dynamic. Because when you shave off bass energy and treble energy, you do lose out on dynamics. And treble energy has something to do with dynamics. Has been my experience. Such has been my experience, because treble does add to the excitement. So if you're playing drums, you can have drumstick hitting drums, and that's sounding lifelike and bombastic and sharp without having the right amount of treble energy. So overall, by losing out a bit on bass and treble energies, this does sound ever so slightly less dynamic to me than the OG Utopia. But that aside, they all sound the same. This looks a bit better, perhaps, and I would not know which Utopia to pick, honestly. So if you watch this review till the end and want to know which Utopia to pick, if you want to save money, go and buy the used Utopia. But if you want the latest shiny toy, of course, then this would be your jam. That's it from me, guys. I hope this was useful, and stay tuned and do like my video if you liked it, and follow my channel, please, if you have not, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye-bye.